At my in-laws' Thanksgiving table, my sister-in-law raised her wine glass, looked straight at me, and said, "Honestly, if Sophie vanished tomorrow, would any of us actually notice?" She smiled when she said it. Everyone laughed. My husband laughed. I set down my fork, looked her dead in the eye, and said, "Let's find out." 3 days later, I was gone. And what I built in the year that followed didn't just answer her question. It answered it in front of 200 wedding guests at the one venue in the mountains she never should have booked. But to understand how I disappeared so cleanly and why it took her exactly 11 months to regret those words, you need to know what 8 years of being furniture in someone else's family does to a person. My name is Sophie Marlowe, or it was, before it became Sophie Whitmore, and then, eventually, just Sophie Marlowe again. I'm 34 years old. For 8 years, I was married to Adam Whitmore, only son of Gordon and Patricia Whitmore of Whitmore Capital Group in Nashville, Tennessee. Old money, 3 generations of it. The kind of family whose name gets you a table at a restaurant that supposedly has no tables left. I was not born into that world. I grew up 40 minutes outside the city, in a town called Delwood, in a house my father built room by room as he could afford the lumber. My father, Frank Marlowe, drove a delivery route for a regional bakery distributor for 26 years. My mother, Carol, worked the front desk at a dental office and picked up catering shifts on weekends. I learned to work banquet floors before I learned to drive. I put myself through Belmont University on a hospitality management scholarship, graduated with honors, and took a job coordinating events at the Hermitage Hotel downtown, one of the most respected properties in the state. I was good at it. I was confident. I had a 5-year plan and a decent 401k and a studio apartment I'd painted myself. Then I met Adam. He came into the Hermitage on a Tuesday night in early spring, part of a group celebrating a colleague's engagement, and he was the only one at the table who thanked the servers by name. He found me afterward near the coat check, said he'd noticed how I'd quietly fixed a seating mix-up before anyone at his table even realized there'd been one. "You run a tight ship," he said. "Most people in this business either panic or they disappear into the background. You did neither." I liked that he saw the work. I liked that he saw me. For those first months, before I'd ever met the rest of his family, Adam seemed genuinely different from what I'd expected of someone who'd grown up the way he had. He drove 3 hours from Nashville most weekends just to see me. Sat through entire semesters of my event management coursework asking real questions. Told me once, tucking a piece of hair behind my ear on a park bench near campus, that I was the most real person he'd ever met. That everyone in his world was performing constantly, and I simply wasn't. I fell in love with the version of him that existed away from Nashville, away from Belmead, away from his family's expectations. And I should have paid closer attention to that specific distinction, because it turned out to matter enormously. 6 months later, we were engaged in a modest little Italian restaurant near campus. No production, no photographer hidden in the bushes, just the 2 of us and a ring that felt, at the time, like the beginning of exactly the life I wanted. The wedding planning told me almost everything I needed to know about the next 8 years, if I'd been paying attention. Patricia took over within a week of the engagement announcement, informing me gently but firmly that she knew how things should be done, and that I was, in her words, far too busy with your little event job to manage all these details yourself. I sat through 3 separate dress fittings that spring, and my mother came to exactly one of them, sitting quietly in the corner of an upscale bridal boutique in Green Hills, while Patricia directed the seamstress on what to take in, what to let out, which neckline was more appropriate for a Whitmore wedding than the one I'd originally chosen because I actually liked it. On the drive home from that fitting, my mother asked me, carefully, the way she asked most difficult questions, "Baby, are you happy?" "Of course," I said automatically, the way I would say it, automatically, dozens more times over the following 8 years. She didn't look convinced. I wish now that I'd noticed how quickly the automatic answer had replaced the honest one. A year after the engagement, we married, in a ceremony his mother had mostly planned, in a chapel his mother had mostly chosen, in front of a guest list his mother had mostly written. 340 guests, most of whom I'd never met before that day. And I remember standing at the altar thinking, with the specific, willful optimism of a 25-year-old in love, that all of this was simply what marrying into an established family looked like, and that I'd settle into it soon enough. I told myself that was normal. I told myself a great many things were normal for a great many years, before I finally let myself notice they weren't. For 8 years, I slowly disappeared into that family the way a coin disappears into a fountain. Still there, technically, but no longer spendable, no longer really yours. The real break came the Thursday before last Thanksgiving at the Whitmore family's annual holiday dinner, held every year at Gordon and Patricia's estate in Belle Meade, the wealthiest old neighborhood in Nashville, a place with iron gates and 100-year oak trees, and a housekeeper named Dolores who'd worked there longer than I'd been alive. I'd spent the entire week preparing it. Menu, florals, table settings, seating charts, place cards written in the calligraphy Patricia preferred, the whole production, because for 6 of our 8 years together, that had quietly become my job. Nobody had ever asked me to take it over. It had simply drifted onto my plate the way water drifts downhill, because I was good at it, because I didn't complain, and because complaining, I had learned early, marked you as difficult in a family that prized nothing more than the appearance of effortlessness. That Thursday morning, Adam left at 7 to go duck hunting with his father and his father's business partners, a tradition that apparently could not be interrupted for a holiday his own wife was hosting. "You've got this handled," he said, kissing my temple without really looking at me. "You always do." I did. I always did. By the time the first guests arrived at 2, I'd been at the estate for 6 hours, steaming linens, adjusting flowers, tasting the gravy twice, coordinating with the catering staff Patricia had hired to help, though we both understood who was actually running the room. Patricia walked through at noon and again at 1:30, making small corrections to my work the way a manager corrects an employee who's almost but not quite good enough. She moved the centerpieces 2 inches to the left. She swapped my ivory table runners for a set of hers that were, in her words, a touch more Whitmore. I'd brought my grandmother's blueberry buckle, a recipe scrawled on an index card so old the ink had gone the color of weak tea. The one dish that had gotten genuine, unprompted compliments at every gathering I'd ever brought it to. I set it in the center of the dessert table. Within 10 minutes, Patricia had moved it to the far end, behind a store-bought pumpkin roll that Brooke, my sister-in-law, had picked up from a bakery downtown and told everyone she'd made herself. Dinner was at 4. I was seated between Adam's great-uncle Walter, who was 91 and mostly deaf, and an empty chair reserved for Brooke, who arrived 40 minutes late with her fiancé, Marcus Delacroix, a real estate developer who'd made his money in luxury condos and never let anyone forget it. "We just signed the contract on Falconhurst Manor," Brooke announced to the table, loud enough that conversation stopped on its own. "For the wedding. It's the most exclusive property in the whole region. Booked 2 years out normally, but Marcus knows people." The table erupted in congratulations. Patricia actually clapped her hands together. "Brooke has always had exquisite taste," she said. "That property is a work of art." There was a small lull after that, one of those rare gaps in a loud table, and I made the mistake of filling it. "I actually know that venue well," I said, keeping my voice light, reaching for the sweet potatoes. "I coordinated a wedding there 2 years ago through the Hermitage. If you ever want vendor recommendations, I'd be happy to help." Brooke cut me off before I finished the sentence, that saccharine smile spreading across her face, the one she used exclusively on me. "Oh, Sophie, that's sweet." A pause timed for effect. "But we're working with an actual planning team, not exactly your budget level." A ripple of laughter went around the table. My face went hot, but I tried once more, quieter this time. "I just thought my experience might be useful." "Honestly," Brooke said, setting down her fork with a theatrical sigh, looking around the table like she was about to deliver the punchline everyone had been waiting for. "If Sophie vanished tomorrow, would any of us actually notice?" She waved her hand toward the room. "The wedding would still be perfect. Dad's business would still run. Adam would still—" Another wave, dismissive, almost bored. "Be Adam. Nothing would change." The table didn't gasp. It laughed. Patricia tittered into her napkin like it was the funniest thing she'd heard all season. Gordon chuckled into his bourbon. Even Great Uncle Walter, who almost certainly hadn't heard the actual sentence, laughed along because everyone else was laughing, the way old men do at parties, trusting the room. And Adam, my husband of 8 years, the man who'd once told me I ran a tight ship, who'd once said I was the most real person he'd ever met. Adam laughed too. Not a big laugh, just a small, easy huff of air through his nose. The kind of laugh that costs a person nothing and tells you everything. Something in me went very still. Not hot, not shaking, still and quiet, and finally, after 8 years, completely clear. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't give them a scene they could later describe to each other as evidence that I was too sensitive or always looking for drama, phrases I'd heard used about other women in that family who dared to object to something out loud. Instead, I picked up my glass of sweet tea, looked directly at Brooke, and said, clearly enough for the whole table to hear, "Let's find out." A short, confused silence followed. Brooke's smile flickered just slightly, like a bulb about to go. Adam glanced between the two of us, sensing that something had shifted without being able to name what. Then Patricia chirped, "Who wants Gordon to carve the turkey?" And the moment passed, swallowed whole by the machinery of a family that had never once let an uncomfortable silence live past 3 seconds. They went back to their wine and their stories and their perfectly rehearsed world. But something in me had changed permanently, and I spent the rest of that dinner not participating, only watching. I watched how easily they all moved through a life built on assumptions I would never be allowed to share. I watched Adam blend seamlessly back into his family, tossing me the occasional absent, dutiful smile, the kind you'd give a coworker you liked fine but wouldn't cross the street for. I cataloged every slight I'd swallowed in 8 years, every joke made at my expense that I'd laughed along with because objecting would have made me the problem. And underneath all of it, I finally heard a voice that had been whispering to me for a long time, one I'd been too tired, too polite, too well-trained to listen to. It wasn't angry. It was simply, finally, done. By the time we left at 7, my decision was already made. The only question left was how and when to execute it. The drive home was silent except for the radio, low, some classic country station Adam liked. He scrolled through his phone at red lights, reading me updates about the duck hunt he'd apparently enjoyed more than his own wife's dinner. I stared out the window at the dark shapes of the Belmead mansions sliding past, already planning, already halfway gone in my head. When we pulled into our driveway, he finally seemed to register that I hadn't said a word in 20 minutes. "You okay?" he asked. "You've been quiet since dinner." I chose my words carefully. Brooke's joke. About me disappearing. Did you think that was funny? He sighed, the specific sigh he used whenever I brought up something he'd already decided wasn't worth discussing. "Don't do this tonight, Soph. You know how Brooke gets, especially with wine in her. It was a joke." "You laughed," I said. "It was a joke," he repeated, like saying it twice made it more true. He opened his car door. "Not everything has to turn into an analysis session." He walked inside. For him, the conversation was already over. For me, it had barely started. That night, Adam fell asleep by 10:30, the specific sleep of a man who golfs and hunts and never once questions whether the ground beneath him is solid. I lay beside him until midnight, listening to his even breathing, and then I got up, walked down the hall to the small home office that had once been meant for a nursery we never filled, closed the door, and opened my laptop. I did not cry. I did not shake. I felt, for the first time in years, something that felt almost like relief. By 3 a.m, I had a plan. By 6, I would begin executing it. And by that evening, Sophie Whitmore would no longer exist in any way that mattered. To understand why I could walk away so cleanly, you have to understand what I'd quietly handed over, piece by piece, across 8 years, in the name of being a good wife, a good daughter-in-law, a good Whitmore. The first sacrifice came 18 months into our marriage. I got a call from a boutique hotel group based in Chicago, a small but highly regarded company that specialized in restoring historic properties into luxury boutique inns. They'd seen my work at the Hermitage and offered me a director of events position at their flagship property. $68,000 a year, full relocation package, a clear path to regional oversight within 3 years. It was, professionally, the exact thing I had built my entire career toward. I was so excited I could barely eat dinner that night before telling Adam. His face did something complicated when I said the word Chicago. "That's 14 hours away," he said. "It's a direct flight," I said. 90 minutes. "I need to be here," he said. "Dad's already grooming me to take over the fixed income division. He's 61. This is the window." "What about my career?" I asked. "You'll find something here," he said, in the tone of a man solving a problem rather than hearing one. "We're building something together that matters more than any single job." I had been raised, the way a lot of women from towns like Delwood are raised, to believe that marriage meant compromise, meant give and take, meant that sometimes you were the one who bent. So I turned down Chicago. I took a coordinator position at a mid-tier events company in Nashville for $41,000 a year, $27,000 less than the offer I'd walked away from. When I mentioned the new job at a family dinner, Patricia had smiled and said, "Oh, how nice, dear, something more manageable." As though the Chicago offer had been a fantasy I'd needed gently talked down from, rather than the single best professional opportunity of my life. The second sacrifice was financial, and it took years to fully add up. By the time Brooke launched her startup, a subscription box service for luxury wedding favors, I had saved $39,000, painstakingly, out of a modest salary, across 6 years of budgeting so careful I could recite our grocery spending down to the dollar. Brooke needed seed capital to show outside investors the family believed in her concept, and at a Sunday dinner, Gordon turned to me specifically. "Sophie, you know this industry better than anyone at this table. What do you think of Brooke's idea?" I gave an honest answer. Good concept, weak margins, needed a stronger logistics partner before it could scale. Patricia beamed. "See, Brooke? Even Sophie thinks it has promise." 2 weeks later, Brooke asked me directly to invest. "Family investment shows confidence to outside money," she said. "It'll help us close the real round." I hesitated. That $39,000 was everything I had, my entire safety net, the only proof I had that I could stand on my own 2 feet if I ever needed to. Adam encouraged me. "It's family, Soph. That's what we do for each other." I invested $22,000. The startup folded 14 months later, quietly, without ceremony. Brooke moved into a role at her father's firm without missing a single week of income. When I brought up the investment once, gently, months later, she looked at me with genuine confusion, as if I'd asked her something rude. "That's what family does, Sophie. We support each other's dreams." A pause. "Besides, it's not like you actually needed that money. Adam makes plenty for both of you." I did need it. My needs, I had learned by then, had simply never made it onto anyone's list of priorities, including my own. That same year, Adam came to me white-faced about $11,000 in credit card debt from a series of bad investment plays he'd made without telling anyone, embarrassed to admit it to his father. "He'll think I'm reckless," Adam said, pacing our bedroom at 11 at night. "This could actually hurt my standing at the firm." So I paid it, with the last of what remained in my personal savings account, which went, after that, to zero. But I was lucky, I reminded myself, to be part of this family. Fortunate. Grateful. That word got used on me constantly, by Patricia especially, the way you'd remind a person of a favor they hadn't asked for, but were somehow expected to keep repaying forever. The third sacrifice was the hardest to measure because it didn't happen all at once. It happened in tiny increments, over years, the way erosion happens. I planned every holiday, every anniversary, every milestone birthday in that family, coordinating caterers and florists and seating charts, while somehow never being credited for any of it. "The Whitmores really know how to throw a party," people would say when things went beautifully. "Sophie's still learning how we do things here," Patricia would say, if a single detail slipped. My name showed up in the family's conversations almost exclusively in the context of correction. I started dressing more like them, quieter colors, more understated cuts, nothing that drew attention or looked, in Patricia's words, like trying too hard. I adopted their vocabulary, their opinions about wine and real estate and which country club had gone downhill. I laughed at inside jokes that existed specifically to remind me I hadn't been there long enough to be inside anything. I got smaller, quieter, less. The pattern repeated itself so consistently at family gatherings that I could have scripted it in advance. Brooke would correct my pronunciation of a wine. "It's Pinot Grigio, Sophie, not Pinot Grigio. You'll pick it up eventually." And the table would chuckle, warm and easy, at my expense. Adam would say nothing. Gordon would explain basic financial concepts to me at length, always prefaced with some version of, "Now, you might not know this, but in wealth management," despite the fact that I held an actual business degree and had, for several years before my career quietly atrophied, managed 6-figure event budgets on my own. Patricia would offer wardrobe notes disguised as gentle concern. That color's lovely on you, dear, but perhaps something a touch more understated for the club. We wouldn't want anyone thinking we're trying too hard. I was seated at every single holiday for 8 straight years, either with the elderly relatives who couldn't hear well enough to include me in real conversation, or with whichever distant cousin happened to be visiting from out of town that year. Never once at the main table where actual business and family decisions got discussed. I became infrastructure, necessary for the machinery of the family to run smoothly, invisible as an actual person the moment the machinery was running the way it was supposed to. I remember, distinctly, who I used to be before any of that started. At Belmont, I'd been president of the Hospitality Management Student Association. I organized networking events that drew alumni from 3 states. I had opinions, and I voiced them loudly in classroom discussions and department meetings alike, because I trusted, without having to think about it, that what I thought was worth other people hearing. I had professors who wrote me recommendation letters I still have saved somewhere in a folder, describing me as one of the most naturally confident students they'd taught in years. That woman didn't disappear all at once. She got quieter, one Thanksgiving at a time, one corrected pronunciation at a time, one swapped centerpiece at a time. Until 8 years later, I genuinely couldn't have told you, if you'd asked me directly at that final Thanksgiving dinner, what my own honest opinion about anything actually was anymore. Because I'd spent so long performing the Whitmore version of an opinion that I'd lost the thread of my own. Maya visited me in Nashville about 3 years into the marriage, and I still think about that trip more than almost any other memory from those years. We met for coffee downtown near the Hermitage, and she studied my face across the table for a long moment before she said anything at all. "Something's different," she said finally. "I can't place it yet, but something's different." "I got new highlights," I offered, deflecting the way I'd gotten very good at deflecting. "That's not it," she said, and kept studying me, the way only someone who's known you since you were 19 can study you, cataloging changes you haven't even noticed in yourself. "You used to interrupt people," she said eventually, "in a good way. When you had an opinion, you just said it, right in the middle of whatever anyone else was saying, because you trusted that what you thought mattered enough to say out loud. You haven't interrupted me once this whole conversation. You've been agreeing with everything I say, even things I know you actually disagree with. I can see it on your face." I laughed it off at the time, told her I was just tired, that marriage changes people, that maybe I'd simply mellowed. She didn't push it that day, but she brought it up again months later over the phone, gently, the way good friends circle back to something they're worried about even when you've asked them to drop it. "I'm not trying to start something," she said. "I just want you to know I noticed, and I'm not going to stop noticing, even if you're not ready to talk about it yet." I wasn't ready. It would take me another 5 years to be ready. But I've thought, many times since, about how much earlier I might have found my way out if I'd let myself actually hear what she was telling me that afternoon over coffee. Instead of spending the drive home convincing myself, she simply didn't understand how families like the Whitmores operated. My mother called me 6 months before that Thanksgiving. "You sound different, baby," she said. "Different how?" I asked. "Like you're performing," she said. "Like you're not really in there anymore." I told her I was fine, just tired. "Tired of what?" she pressed gently. I didn't answer because I didn't yet have the language for what I actually meant, which was tired of disappearing, on purpose, one polite smile at a time. That night in the office, planning by laptop light, I worked the way I'd been trained to work for my entire career, methodically, with checklists, with contingencies. I opened a browser window and typed Apartments, Asheville, North Carolina, because Asheville was 3.5 hours away, far enough to feel like a real distance, close enough that I could still see my mother without a plane ticket. I searched Divorce Attorney, Nashville, Tennessee. I opened a blank document and began a list. Bank accounts, joint assets, documentation, personal items that were unquestionably mine and mine alone. By 1 in the morning, I had 11 browser tabs open. By 3, I had something resembling a plan. It wasn't elegant, but it was real, and it was mine. The first thing that had been entirely mine and longer than I wanted to admit. I went back to bed at 3:30. Adam never stirred. I didn't sleep. I just waited, staring at the ceiling fan turning slow circles in the dark, counting down the hours until his 6 a.m. alarm. When it went off, he showered, dressed for a morning meeting with his father about year-end portfolio reviews, and kissed my forehead on his way out the door. "Love you," he murmured, already checking his phone. Back around 6. The garage door closed at 6:20. I counted to 100, just to be sure, and then I called Maya. Maya Ferris had been my roommate at Belmont and my closest friend for 16 years, one of the only people from my old life the Whitmores had never fully managed to edge out, mostly because Maya was too stubborn to be edged. She answered on the second ring, voice thick with sleep. "It's 6:30 in the morning, Soph. Someone better be dying." "I'm leaving Adam today," I said. There was a pause, and then, instead of, "Are you sure?" Instead of, "Have you thought this through?" Instead of any of the 100 hesitations I half expected, she just said, "What do you need?" Those 3 words did something to me that 8 years of Whitmore holidays never had. "A place to stay tonight," I said, "and someone to help me pack." "I'm an hour out," she said. "Don't touch a single box until I get there. Actually, no. Touch whatever you need to touch. I trust you completely. I'm leaving right now." I trust you. I hadn't heard those 3 words from anyone in that family. Not once in 8 years. Maya arrived at 7:40 with 3 coffees, a roll of packing tape, and a stack of flattened moving boxes she'd apparently kept in her garage for exactly this kind of emergency. "Where do we start?" she asked, setting everything on the kitchen island like a field medic. "Bedroom," I said. "Only what's actually mine." We moved fast and quiet. Clothes from my side of the closet, not the dresses Patricia had steered me toward over the years, just the pieces that still felt like me underneath all the beige. My laptop, my external hard drive with 11 years of professional portfolio work on it, photographs of my parents and my grandmother and my Belmont graduation, nothing with a single Whitmore in the frame. My grandmother's index card with the blueberry buckle recipe, tucked carefully into a folder like a passport. When Maya held up a crystal vase Patricia had given us as a wedding gift, I shook my head. "You like that vase," Maya said. "No," I corrected her quietly. "I learned to act like I liked it." She set it back on the shelf without another word. By 11, we had 4 boxes and 2 suitcases loaded into my car. My entire adult life distilled down to what fit in a Honda CR-V. While Maya organized the trunk, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and pulled up our joint checking account. Balance: $51,400. I did the math twice to be sure. Half was $25,700. I logged into the small personal savings account I'd stubbornly kept separate throughout our marriage, despite Adam's repeated, gentle suggestions that we simplify everything into shared accounts. And I transferred exactly $25,700 into it. Not a penny more. Then I pulled up the household bills spreadsheet I'd maintained for years, calculated my exact half of the mortgage due the following week and the average monthly utilities, wrote a check for our joint share of upcoming obligations, and left it on the kitchen counter. Maya watched from the doorway. "You could take more," she said. "God knows you've earned more." "No," I said. 50-50. I want them to have zero legitimate complaints, nothing they can point to and call me the villain of this story. "You're being too fair," she said. "I'm being strategic," I said, and I meant it. I photographed every transaction, every screenshot, a clean paper trail proving I had taken exactly what I was legally entitled to and not $1 more. At 1 o'clock, I sat down to write the letter. I kept it short and clinical because anything longer would have given them material to twist. Adam, I need time and space to reevaluate this marriage. I have taken only what is mine and have covered my share of our current obligations. Please respect my need for distance and do not attempt to contact me. My attorney will be in touch. Sophie. I printed it and set it on the counter. Beside it, I placed a second sheet of paper, just facts, no commentary. If Sophie vanished tomorrow, would any of us actually notice? Brooke Whitmore. Thanksgiving dinner, the Whitmore Estate, Belle Meade, Tennessee. Witnesses, approximately 30 guests. Then I took off my wedding ring, a 3-carat emerald-cut diamond that had cost more than my entire student loan balance, and set it gently on top of the letter. It felt lighter leaving my hand than I expected it to. At 2:30, Maya and I stood in the driveway. My car was packed. Everything that actually mattered fit in a trunk and a back seat. "You ready?" she asked. I looked back once at the house, a handsome white colonial with a lawn Adam paid a service to maintain, and pictured him pulling into that driveway at 6, walking in expecting dinner, finding instead an empty closet, a letter, and a ring. "Yeah," I said. "I'm ready." Maya pulled out first to lead the way, and I followed her through streets I'd driven 1,000 times, past the Hermitage where I'd once had a 5-year plan, past the turnoff toward Belle Meade, each mile another few ounces of weight lifting off my chest. When we crossed the state line into North Carolina, I took the first full, uncomplicated breath I'd taken in longer than I could remember. I checked into a modest inn on the edge of downtown Asheville around 5 that evening. Nothing fancy, just a clean room with a firm mattress and a window that looked out over the mountains instead of a manicured lawn. It felt, somehow, like exactly the right kind of place to start over. I texted my mother. "I'm safe. I left Adam. Please don't tell anyone where I am. I need time. Love you." Her reply came back in under a minute. "Baby girl, I have been waiting years for this text. I'm here whenever you're ready, no questions asked." I texted Maya, "Thank you for everything. I'll call you tomorrow." Then I turned my phone off entirely, took a long shower, ordered soup from the diner down the street, and slept 9 hours without a single dream about trying to be someone I wasn't. The next morning, I turned my phone back on just long enough to see the damage. 43 messages from Adam. I scrolled through the previews without opening most of them. 6:12 p.m. Where are you? 6:40 p.m. This isn't funny, call me. 7:55 p.m. Sophie, come home so we can talk like adults. 9:20 p.m. My mother is worried sick. The least you could do is let her know you're alive. 11:05 p.m. You are being incredibly selfish right now. Do you understand what you're doing to this family? 1:15 a.m. Fine. Take your space. I have the Dallas trip in 4 days anyway. We'll deal with this when I'm back. Not one message mentioned Brooke's comment. Not one asked what he might have gotten wrong. Every single one was about my timing, my selfishness, my overreaction, as though the 8 years that preceded that Thanksgiving dinner had simply never happened. I sent my mother one more text. "I'm safe. We'll call soon. Please tell no one," and turned the phone off again. Over the next 2 weeks, I did the unglamorous work of rebuilding a life from studs. I found a small furnished one-bedroom above a coffee shop on Haywood Street, signed a month-to-month lease, and used part of my savings to keep myself afloat while I figured out my next move. I updated my resume for the first time in years, listing everything I'd actually accomplished professionally instead of the diminished version I'd let myself become at home. I reached out to 3 boutique hospitality groups in the area. 2 never called back. The third, a small but well-regarded catering and event company called Blue Ridge Table, brought me in for an interview with its owner, a sharp, silver-haired woman named Renata Osei, who had built the company from a single food truck into the region's most sought-after private event caterer over 18 years. She looked at my resume, then at me, for a long moment. "You coordinated the Ashworth Hale wedding at the Hermitage," she said. "I did," I said, surprised she'd recognized it. "That was one of the best-run events I've been to in a decade, and I've been to hundreds," Renata said. "I remember thinking whoever ran that room deserved their own company." "I've thought about it," I admitted, "for years, actually." "What stopped you?" she asked. I thought about how to answer that honestly. "I got very good at making other people's lives run smoothly," I said finally. "And somewhere in there, I forgot to build one of my own." Renata studied me for a moment longer, then slid a folder across the table. "I don't need another coordinator," she said. "I need an operations partner, someone who can run events at the level you clearly know how to run them, and who's hungry enough to help me grow this thing into something bigger. It won't pay much at first, but if you're as good as that wedding tells me you are, it will pay a great deal eventually." I signed on that afternoon. My first Christmas alone in Asheville, a little over a month after I'd arrived, was one of the hardest days of that entire first year. Harder in some ways than the day I'd actually left. I'd expected the leaving to hurt. I hadn't fully prepared myself for how strange the quiet would feel on a holiday that had, for 8 years, meant a full week of frantic coordination, 40-plus guests, and a schedule so packed there was never a spare minute to actually feel anything. That first Christmas morning in my small apartment above the coffee shop, I woke up with absolutely nothing to organize, no seating chart to finalize, no centerpieces to defend from Patricia's opinions, and for about an hour, I sat on my secondhand couch feeling strangely untethered, unsure what a holiday was supposed to feel like without a job attached to it. My mother drove up that afternoon with a full dinner already cooked, packed carefully into her car in Tupperware containers, and we ate at my small kitchen table, just the 2 of us. No place cards, no seating chart, no calligraphy. "This is the best Christmas I've had in years," she told me afterward. And I remember being surprised to realize, sitting there in the quiet, that I agreed with her completely. It wasn't grand. It wasn't Ashford standard or Whitmore standard or anyone's standard but our own. It was simply mine, and that turned out to be more than enough. Renata became, over that first year, something closer to family than employer, in a way I hadn't expected and wasn't initially sure how to accept gracefully. She'd built Blue Ridge Table from a single food truck after leaving a corporate hospitality career in her 30s, raising 2 kids largely on her own in the process, and she had a specific, low tolerance for anyone underselling their own work, mine included. "Stop apologizing before you tell me your ideas," she told me, more than once during those early months, whenever I'd preface a suggestion with some version of, "I don't know if this makes sense, but..." "You know exactly whether it makes sense. Say the idea first. Apologize never, unless you're actually wrong, and even then, just fix it and move on. It took me the better part of a year to fully unlearn the reflex she was pointing at, the specific, trained instinct to make myself smaller before anyone else had the chance to do it for me. By the time she offered me that first partnership stake, I'd mostly managed it. By the time she raised it to 45%, I'd stopped prefacing my ideas with apologies almost entirely, a small private milestone that meant more to me than most of the actual business numbers we celebrated that year. The first few months at Blue Ridge Table were exhausting, in the way that honest work is exhausting. The good kind of tired, the kind you actually earn. I redesigned their client onboarding process, built a proper vendor network across the region, and personally ran 6 events in my first 10 weeks, each one tighter and more polished than the last. Word started to travel the way it does in the wedding and hospitality world, quietly, through planners and photographers and venue managers who talk to each other constantly. By month 4, Blue Ridge Table had a 3-month waiting list for consultations alone. By month 6, Renata came to me with a proposal. "I want to make this official," she said. "Full partnership, 30% equity, your name on the door alongside mine." I sat with that for a long moment before I could speak. "Renata, that's incredibly generous." "It's not generous," she said. "It's accurate. You've earned every percentage point of it." I signed the partnership papers on a Tuesday morning in April, in a small law office 2 blocks from the coffee shop where I'd first rented a 1-bedroom above the street noise. And I remember thinking, quite clearly, that no one in Belle Meade, Tennessee, had ever once told me I'd earned anything. It wasn't all smooth from there, and I think it's important to say that clearly, because the version of this story where everything simply clicked into place the moment I left would be a comfortable lie rather than an honest one. My 3rd week at Blue Ridge Table, I ran a 50th anniversary dinner for a wealthy Asheville couple and made the kind of mistake I hadn't made in years. I misjudged the guest count communication between the family and the caterer, and 11 people showed up to plated seats that didn't exist. I spent 45 frantic minutes rearranging tables, apologizing personally to the family, and covering the shortfall out of my own pocket for a rush order from a nearby restaurant, all while Renata watched from across the room, arms crossed, saying nothing until the event ended. Afterward, in the parking lot, I braced myself for exactly the kind of quiet, cutting correction I'd absorbed for 8 years at Whitmore family functions. Instead, Renata just said, "You fixed it in under an hour without a single guest noticing anything was wrong. That's not a failure story, Sophie. That's a recovery story. Those are different things, and you need to learn to tell them apart. Because you flinched just now like you were expecting me to fire you over it." I sat in my car afterward and cried for the first time since leaving Adam. Not out of sadness exactly, but out of something closer to disbelief. The strange, disorienting relief of making a mistake and discovering the ground didn't open up beneath you as a result. There was also, that first winter, a legal scare I hadn't anticipated. Gordon's attorney sent a letter, forwarded through Priya, claiming the $22,000 I'd invested in Brooke's failed startup years earlier should be considered a loan rather than a gift, and demanding repayment now that I had, in the letter's words, established independent financial means. Priya laughed out loud when she read it to me over the phone. "There's no loan agreement anywhere in the record," she said. "No promissory note, no interest terms, nothing. This is a pressure tactic, not a legal claim, and a fairly weak one at that." She sent back a 2-paragraph response citing the complete absence of any loan documentation, and the matter evaporated within a week, never mentioned again. But I remember the 3 days between receiving that letter and Priya's response landing. how my hands had gone cold reading it, how quickly and completely 8 years of training myself to absorb blame without question had come rushing back the moment a Whitmore letterhead reappeared in my life. It took me those 3 days to remember something I'd apparently still needed reminding of. I no longer owed that family the benefit of the doubt, and I certainly didn't owe them $22,000 for the privilege of having once tried to belong to them. The divorce moved faster than I expected once Adam's attorney realized how little there actually was to fight over. I hadn't touched a cent beyond my legal half. I had documentation for every transaction, and I had no interest in the house, the furniture, or anything with a Whitmore fingerprint on it. Adam tried, through his lawyer, to frame my departure as abandonment, as though 8 years of running his family's entire social calendar without credit didn't count as a contribution to the marriage. My attorney, a calm, unbothered woman named Priya Chandrasekaran, who specialized in exactly this kind of case, simply forwarded the spreadsheet I'd kept for 6 years, documenting every event I'd planned, every dollar I'd personally spent maintaining the Whitmore family's public image, and every hour logged doing unpaid labor that any outside vendor would have billed thousands for. The conversation about abandonment ended immediately. The divorce was finalized in February, 5 months after I'd walked out of that colonial for the last time. I did not attend the final hearing in person. I sat in a diner in Asheville, ordered pancakes I didn't finish, and felt something settle in my chest that I can only describe as the sound of a door closing gently instead of slamming. My mother came to visit for the first time that same month, driving up from Delwood on a Saturday with a Tupperware of her own cooking and an expression I hadn't seen on her face in years. "You look different, baby girl," she said, studying me across the small kitchen table in my apartment. "Different how?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "Like you can actually breathe," she said. "I can," I told her, and meant it completely. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I should have said something sooner," she admitted, "about how that family treated you. I saw it for years and I stayed quiet because I didn't think it was my place." "I wouldn't have listened," I said honestly. "I had to see it myself in my own time." "Well," she said, "you saw it, and then you did something about it. That takes a kind of courage most people never find." We talked for 3 hours that afternoon about Asheville, about Blue Ridge Table, about everything I'd rebuilt in 5 months. And when she hugged me goodbye in the parking lot, she whispered, "You're finally exactly where you're supposed to be." I believed her. It was around that same time that I met Owen Hale, almost by accident, at a farm-to-table dinner Blue Ridge Table catered for a local land conservancy fundraiser. Owen ran a small architecture firm specializing in historic renovations, the kind of quiet, careful man who noticed things other people didn't, like the fact that I always double-checked the exits at any venue before an event started, an old habit from years of running rooms where something could go wrong at any moment. "You case every space you're in," he said, refilling my water glass without being asked. "Occupational hazard," I said. "Or a survival skill," he said, "depending on where you learned it." I didn't tell him the whole story that first night. I told him enough over the following months, in pieces, the way you tell someone a story you're still learning to say out loud without flinching. He never once told me I was overreacting. He never once laughed at the wrong moment. Small things, I've since learned, that turn out to be enormous things. Blue Ridge Table kept growing through that spring and summer, and Renata and I made a decision that would end up mattering more than either of us realized at the time. We entered into an exclusive preferred vendor partnership with Falconhurst Manor, a restored 19th century estate 40 minutes outside Asheville, that had recently changed hands and was repositioning itself as the premier luxury wedding venue in the western half of the state. The new owners, a hospitality investment group out of Charlotte, wanted a single dedicated catering and event coordination partner instead of an open vendor list. And after a competitive process that took most of the summer, they chose us. It was, by a significant margin, the largest deal Blue Ridge Table had ever signed, and it meant that starting that October, every single wedding booked at Falconhurst Manor would run through our team exclusively for at least the next 3 years. I remember signing that contract and thinking, with a kind of quiet satisfaction I still hadn't fully gotten used to, that I had built this. Not inherited it, not married into it, not been handed it by a family that would remind me of the gift for the rest of my life. Built it. From a laptop in a rented one-bedroom at 3 a.m, with nothing but a plan and a stubborn refusal to disappear the way I'd been asked to. Fall wedding season at Falconhurst opened in October with a run of 6 ceremonies in 8 weeks, and I threw myself into it the way I used to throw myself into Whitmore holidays. Except this time, every hour I logged actually belonged to me. I learned every inch of that property. Which fireplace in the east parlor smoked if the wind came from the north, which section of the garden lawn stayed soggy after rain and needed decking boards laid down before guests arrived in heels, which caterer's van could actually make the tight turn behind the old carriage house without clipping the boxwoods. By November, the property's general manager, a brisk, efficient man named Desmond Cole, told Renata privately that bookings had increased nearly 40% since our team came on, almost entirely due to word of mouth from couples who'd been guests at earlier weddings and immediately wanted their own. "Whatever she's doing," he reportedly told Renata, meaning me, "keep doing it and give her a raise." Renata, delighted, gave me both. The second wedding of that run tested every bit of composure I'd rebuilt in the months since leaving Nashville. A late October storm rolled in without warning 2 hours before an outdoor ceremony for a couple who'd specifically chosen Falconhurst for its garden setting, dropping the temperature 15 degrees and threatening rain the radar insisted was still an hour away, right up until the moment it wasn't. I made the call to move the entire ceremony indoors to the ballroom with 40 minutes' notice, which meant reworking the seating chart, relocating the string quartet, adjusting the lighting design, and personally explaining the change to a bride who'd been picturing her outdoor garden ceremony since she was a teenager, all while the actual rain started hammering the windows behind us. I remember crouching next to her chair in the bridal suite, her mascara already starting to run, and saying, as calmly as I could manage, "I promise you this is going to be beautiful. Different from what you pictured, but beautiful. And in 20 years, you're going to tell people the story of the storm before you tell them the story of the flowers." She laughed, wetly, and let me lead her downstairs. The ballroom ceremony, improvised in under 40 minutes, ended up in 3 separate wedding blogs that winter as an example of exactly the kind of adaptive, high-pressure execution that had made Blue Ridge Table's reputation in the region. I didn't think about the Whitmore family once during those 40 frantic minutes, not a single second of it. And it wasn't until I was driving home that night, soaked and exhausted and quietly proud, that I realized how significant that absence actually was. A year earlier, under that same kind of pressure, some old, trained part of me would have spent half my energy bracing for someone else's disappointment. That night, all my energy simply went toward solving the actual problem in front of me, which, I've come to understand, is what competence looks like once you've finally stopped performing it for an audience that was never going to applaud anyway. That same winter brought a different kind of challenge, one with no storm clouds involved at all. A larger regional hospitality group out of Charlotte, flush with private equity money, opened a competing venue 20 minutes from Falconhurst and began aggressively undercutting our pricing to lure away couples who'd already signed contracts elsewhere, offering steep discounts to anyone willing to break an existing deposit. We lost 2 bookings that January to the new venue's aggressive pricing before Renata and I sat down to figure out how to respond. My instinct, trained by years of watching the Whitmores handle any perceived threat with money and status rather than substance, was to consider matching their discounts, competing on price the way Gordon would have. Renata talked me out of it within minutes. "We don't win by being cheaper," she said. "We win by being better, and by making sure every single couple who tours with us understands exactly what that difference actually looks like on their wedding day." So instead of discounting anything, we doubled down on what had actually built the company in the first place: personal walkthroughs with every prospective couple, detailed contingency planning most venues never bothered offering, a level of hands-on coordination competitors were structurally incapable of matching because they were staffed for volume rather than care. Within 4 months, 3 of the couples who'd initially chosen the discount venue came back to us anyway, citing exactly the kind of gaps in service the lower price had ultimately cost them. It was a small, quiet vindication of something I'd learned the hard way years earlier at a family table where being genuinely good at something had never once been enough to earn recognition on its own. Sometimes, the only real answer to being underestimated isn't arguing louder. It's simply continuing to do the work at a level nobody underestimating you is actually capable of matching. I want to be honest about something, because the version of this story where everything after leaving Adam went smoothly would be a lie, and I promised myself a long time ago that I wouldn't lie about any of this, not even the parts that make me look less than triumphant. There were nights that fall, alone in my apartment above the coffee shop, when the quiet felt less like peace and more like absence, when I'd catch myself missing the noise of a full house, even though I knew exactly how hollow that noise had been. There was a Tuesday in November when I sat in my car in the Blue Ridge Table parking lot for 20 minutes before a client meeting because I'd seen, through a mutual friend's public Instagram story, a photo from a Whitmore family dinner I hadn't been invited to and, a year earlier, would have been the one hosting. It didn't hurt because I wanted to go back. It hurt in the specific, complicated way that grief hurts even when you know the thing you lost wasn't actually good for you. Owen, when I told him about it that night, didn't try to fix the feeling or talk me out of it. He just said, "You're allowed to miss the idea of a family, even after you've correctly walked away from the one you had." I think about that sentence more than almost anything else anyone said to me that year. Adam tried to reach me twice more through the winter, both times through channels that felt calculated rather than genuine. The first was a card, forwarded through Priya's office, congratulating me on the divorce being finalized in a tone so formal it read like something his mother had helped draft. The second was a message on LinkedIn, of all places, 3 lines long, wishing me well in my new venture, which he referred to as the catering thing, a phrase that told me everything about how little he'd actually absorbed about who I was or what I'd built. I didn't respond to either. Not out of spite, but because I genuinely had nothing left to say to him that wouldn't have required relitigating 8 years I had already, carefully, filed away. Brooke's engagement to Marcus, meanwhile, had apparently hit a rough patch sometime that winter, something I only learned secondhand through Maya, who still had a foot in the Nashville social world and occasionally passed along updates I hadn't asked for but didn't entirely mind receiving. The wedding at the original Falconhurst-adjacent venue Brooke had bragged about at Thanksgiving had fallen through, according to Maya's sources, over a dispute about the contract's cancellation terms after Marcus's development company hit an unexpected zoning delay that pushed their timeline back nearly a full year. "She's apparently furious," Maya told me over the phone one night in January, telling everyone the original venue mishandled the whole thing. I remember feeling, in that moment, nothing in particular. Not satisfaction, not sympathy, just a kind of distant professional curiosity. The same curiosity I'd feel hearing about any client's canceled contract. I had no idea that January night how directly that thread would eventually loop back around to me. Spring came, and with it, Blue Ridge Table's busiest booking season yet. Renata and I hired 2 additional coordinators and a full-time florist to keep pace with demand, and by April, our calendar at Falconhurst Manor alone was booked solid through the following autumn. I had, in 8 months, gone from a woman who'd fled a marriage with 4 boxes and 2 suitcases to a business partner with real equity, a growing client roster, a man in my life who actually listened when I talked, and a mother who called just to hear how good things were going, instead of to check whether I was okay. I remember standing in the Falconhurst garden one Saturday evening in late April, watching a couple share their first dance under string lights I'd personally supervised the installation of, and thinking, with a clarity that still surprised me some mornings, that I had built every single piece of the life standing in front of me. Nobody had handed me any of it. Nobody had ever once told me, in that new life, that I should be grateful simply for being allowed in the room. Sometime in that stretch, right around what would have been my 9th wedding anniversary, a date I only remembered because it happened to fall the same week as one of our biggest bookings of the spring, I found myself, unexpectedly, taking stock. I sat at my desk one evening after everyone else had gone home. The office quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator in the small kitchenette down the hall. And I made a list, an actual physical list on a legal pad, the way I used to make lists at 3 a.m. in that old home office back in Belmead. Except this one was a very different kind of accounting. On one side, I wrote everything I'd had 9 years earlier, at 25, standing at that altar in a chapel Patricia had chosen. A career I loved, a clear 5-year plan, $39,000 in savings, a sense of exactly who I was. On the other side, I wrote everything I had now, 34 years old, sitting alone in a quiet office I partly owned, a company with my name on the partnership papers, a fiancé who'd never once asked me to be smaller, a mother who called just to celebrate rather than to check on my survival, and a version of myself that felt, on most days, remarkably close to the 23-year-old who'd once been confident enough to hand a stranger her phone number across a hotel bar without a second thought. It wasn't a perfect symmetry. I'd lost 8 years I would never get back, and there were still nights, rarer now but not entirely gone, when some old, trained reflex flared up unexpectedly, some instinct to shrink or apologize or defer that I had to consciously catch and set back down. But looking at that legal pad, at the 2 columns side by side, I understood something I hadn't let myself fully believe before. I hadn't just survived leaving. I had, against every quiet prediction that family had ever made about me, actually won, in the only sense of that word that ever really mattered, by becoming, finally, entirely and unmistakably, myself. The call came on a Wednesday morning in May, a little after 10, while I was at my desk reviewing linen orders for a wedding that weekend. Our front-of-house coordinator, a sharp young woman named Priscilla who handled most initial inquiries, buzzed my line. "Sophie, I've got a couple on hold for a Falconhurst consultation. Bride's asking specifically for the senior partner. Says she wants," and I'm quoting her directly, Whoever actually runs the place now. I picked up the line without thinking much of it. We got a version of that request from nervous brides at least once a week. This is Sophie Marlowe. Thanks for calling Blue Ridge Table. There was a pause on the other end, just half a second too long to be nothing. And then a voice I would have recognized anywhere, in any city, after any number of years said, "Sophie?" I sat very still. "Brooke." "Oh my God," she said, and I could hear her covering the phone, presumably to say something to Marcus beside her. "I did not expect. The website just said Sophie M. I genuinely thought—" She laughed, an unsteady, unfamiliar sound, nothing like the smooth performance laugh I remembered from every Whitmore dinner table. "This is insane. You run the catering company at Falconhurst?" "I'm a partner at Blue Ridge Table, yes," I said, keeping my voice level, professional, the exact voice I used with any client because that was, in that moment, precisely what she was. "We're the exclusive event partner for the property." Silence stretched for a few seconds. "Our original venue fell through," Brooke said finally, some of the polish coming back into her voice, though thinner now, more careful. "Marcus's timeline shifted and we lost our deposit, and honestly, it's been a nightmare of a year. And someone recommended Falconhurst as, quote, the best-run venue in the region right now, and I had no idea it was connected to you at all." I let that sit for a moment before answering. 8 years of biting back responses at Whitmore family dinners had trained me well for exactly this kind of pause. "It's a beautiful property," I said finally. "We'd be glad to walk you through what a wedding there would look like, the same way we would with any couple." "Would that be weird for you?" Brooke asked, and for the first time in the entire conversation, in the entire 8 years I'd known her, she sounded genuinely uncertain rather than performing certainty for an audience. "It doesn't have to be," I said. "I run a professional business. If you'd like to book with us, we'll treat you exactly the way we treat every client who walks through that door. If you'd rather find another venue, I understand that too, and there's no hard feelings either way." There was another pause, longer this time, and I could hear, faintly, Marcus's voice in the background asking what was going on. "We already put down the deposit 2 weeks ago," Brooke admitted finally. "Before I knew, I don't think we can pull out now without losing another $12,000. Not after last time." "Then I suppose," I said, "we'll be working together." I scheduled her initial walkthrough for the following Thursday and hung up the phone with hands that, for the first time in 9 months, were not entirely steady. I told Renata that afternoon, laying out the whole history in broad strokes, the Thanksgiving dinner, the comment, the 8 years, everything I hadn't shared with her before because it had never seemed relevant to the job. She listened without interrupting, the way she listened to everything. And when I finished, she leaned back in her chair. "Do you want to hand this account to someone else on the team?" she asked. "I'll support whatever you decide, no questions." I thought about it, seriously, for longer than I expected to. Part of me wanted to. Part of me wanted to never see Brooke Whitmore's face again as long as I lived. But a bigger part of me, the part that had spent 8 years being managed out of every room that mattered, refused to be managed out of this one too. "No," I said finally. "I built this company. I'm not going to hide from a client because of who she used to be to me. I'm going to run her wedding better than anyone in the state could have. And I'm going to do it because it's my job, not because I need her to see anything." Renata smiled, the small, knowing smile she gave whenever I said something that confirmed why she'd made me a partner in the first place. "That," she said, is exactly the answer I was hoping you'd give. The walkthrough that Thursday was, by any professional measure, entirely unremarkable, which was itself its own kind of victory. I met Brooke and Marcus at the front gate at 10 in the morning, shook both their hands, and spent 90 minutes walking them through the gardens, the ballroom, the carriage house reception space, discussing timelines and vendor logistics, and the specific acoustic quirks of the East Lawn in the exact tone I would have used with any couple who'd walk through that gate. Brooke, for her part, was quieter than I'd ever seen her, deferring to my recommendations on nearly every point, agreeing to a floral vendor I suggested without a single argument, something the old Brooke would never have done, not because my suggestion was wrong, but because agreeing with me had simply never occurred to her as an option. Near the end of the walkthrough, standing alone for a moment near the old carriage house while Marcus took a work call, she said quietly, "You're really good at this." "I know," I said, without any edge in it, because it was simply true, and I no longer needed to soften a true thing to make it comfortable for someone else to hear. "You always were," Brooke said. "At everything, actually. I don't think any of us ever said that out loud." I didn't say anything back. Some silences are their own kind of answer, and I'd learned, in the last 9 months, exactly how to let one sit without rushing to fill it. Over the following 4 months, I worked Brooke's wedding the way I worked every wedding at Falconhurst, thoroughly, professionally, without a single shortcut taken because of who was writing the checks. There were moments that tested me. Patricia called the venue directly at one point, apparently unaware, or perhaps aware and testing the waters anyway, that I was the one who'd answer. And when she realized who she was speaking to, there was a long pause before she recovered her composure and asked, in a voice several degrees warmer than any she'd ever used with me as her daughter-in-law, whether we could accommodate a slightly larger guest count. "Of course, Patricia," I said. "I'll have our team send over updated seating logistics by end of day." I hung up the phone and sat for a moment in the quiet of my office, feeling nothing sharper than mild professional satisfaction, which was, in its own way, the most complete revenge I could have asked for. The years of feeling small in that woman's presence simply weren't in the room with me anymore. Adam, I learned through the standard vendor paperwork listing family contacts, would be attending as best man, which meant that at some point over that long summer, I would very likely be standing in the same building as my ex-husband for the first time since the morning I'd driven across the state line into North Carolina. I thought about that more than I expected to, turning it over some nights while Owen slept beside me, trying to figure out what I actually wanted from that eventual moment. Not an apology, I realized eventually, though I suspected one might come. Not a scene, and certainly not a reconciliation. What I wanted, when I was honest with myself, was simply to stand in a room he'd once been part of and feel nothing shrink inside me. That was the whole ambition. Everything else was noise. The wedding took place on the second Saturday of September, a warm, golden evening with almost no humidity, the kind of Blue Ridge mountain weather that made every photographer's job effortless. I arrived at 6 that morning, the way I always did for a wedding this size, and spent the first several hours running the same checklist I'd run 100 times. Linens, florals, catering staging, timeline confirmations with the officiants, a walk of the grounds to check for anything the overnight dew might have disturbed. By early afternoon, the property had transformed into the kind of scene that looks effortless, specifically because someone spent an entire day making sure it would. 210 guests filled the lawn chairs facing the old oak at the center of the garden. String lights I had personally supervised the electrician on, threaded through the branches above. I stood near the carriage house entrance at 4:15, headset on, watching the wedding party assemble. And that was the moment I saw Adam for the first time in nearly a year. There's a particular kind of focus that takes over during a wedding day, a tunnel that narrows everything down to timelines and contingencies, and I was grateful for it that afternoon, because it left very little room for anything else to creep in around the edges. I'd chosen the florals personally for this one, a departure from our usual approach of leaving that entirely to the floral vendor. Garden roses and eucalyptus, and a specific pale blush dahlia that I knew, from years of professional muscle memory, photographed beautifully against the carriage house's weathered brick. I'd walked the ceremony space 3 separate times that morning, checking sight lines from every guest row, because I still remembered, with total clarity, every wedding I'd ever attended in that family where some detail had gone slightly wrong, and my name, not the actual planner's, had somehow ended up attached to the blame. That wasn't going to happen at this wedding. Not because I owed Brooke a flawless day exactly, but because I owed myself one. The specific, private satisfaction of knowing that whatever else happened in that building over the next 8 hours, the actual event itself would be executed at a level none of them had ever once given me credit for being capable of. By 3:30, the string quartet had run through their sound check, the officiant had confirmed the processional order twice, and I'd personally walked the catering team through the timing on the first course, so there'd be no gap between the ceremony ending and cocktail hour beginning. The kind of gap that guests always notice even when they can't articulate what felt slightly off about it. Desmond, the property's general manager, found me near the coordination table around 4 to tell me the property owners had flown in from Charlotte specifically to see this event, having heard it would be one of the largest and most prominent weddings Falconhurst had hosted since our partnership began. "No pressure," he said, with the small, knowing smile of a man who understood exactly how much pressure that actually was. "You've got this," I told him, though I think we both understood I was really saying it to myself. He looked older, somehow, in a way that had nothing to do with actual time past. He was adjusting his cufflinks near the groomsmen's staging area, and when he glanced up and saw me standing there in my earpiece and my professional black blazer, clipboard in hand, something crossed his face that I can only describe as recognition arriving several years too late. He started toward me, and I held up one hand, not unkindly, just clearly. "I'm working, Adam," I said. "This isn't the time." "Sophie," he said anyway, stopping a few feet away. "I had no idea you were. Brooke never said." "She knows," I said. "It's been on every piece of paperwork for 4 months. I have to check on the florist." I turned and walked away, and I want to be honest that some small, old part of me expected to feel shaken doing that. Expected my hands to tremble the way they used to whenever I stood up for myself in front of that family. They didn't. I checked on the florist. The florist was fine. Everything, as it turned out, was fine, because I had made sure of it, the way I always did. Except now, I was the one who got to walk away from the conversation, instead of the one left standing there absorbing whatever was said to me. The ceremony went off without a single visible flaw, and the reception that followed was, by every objective measure, one of the finest events Blue Ridge Table had run all year. I stood at the back of the ballroom during the toasts, monitoring the timeline on my clipboard the way I always did, and I watched Gordon Whitmore stand to give the father of the bride speech, watched him thank, by name, the caterer, the florist, and the venue coordination team for the finest wedding, in his words, that Nashville society had seen in a decade, without once seeming to register, or perhaps carefully avoiding registering, that the woman running that coordination team was the same daughter-in-law his family had spent 8 years treating as invisible. Patricia found me near the dessert table an hour later, glass of champagne in hand, and said, with what I believe was genuine, if extremely late sincerity, "Sophie, this has all been extraordinary. I don't think I ever properly understood what you were capable of." "No," I agreed, adjusting a tray of the mini blueberry buckle tarts I'd added to the dessert menu myself. A quiet, private joke only I understood the full weight of. "I don't think you did." She didn't have a response for that, and for once, in 8 years of knowing her, I didn't feel any need to fill the silence for her comfort. Near the very end of the night, after most of the guests had drifted toward the fire pit scattered across the back lawn, Brooke found me near the coordination table where I was reconciling final vendor timelines for the morning breakdown crew. She'd taken off her heels somewhere along the way and was holding them by the straps in one hand, champagne in the other, looking younger and less armored than I'd ever once seen her at any Whitmore family gathering. "Can I say something?" she asked. "And you don't have to say anything back if you don't want to." I set down my pen. "Go ahead." "That thing I said at Thanksgiving," she said, "about you disappearing. I've thought about it more times this year than I'd like to admit, especially standing in a venue tonight that exists, apparently, because of exactly how not disappeared you turned out to be." She let out a short, humorless laugh. "I told myself for a long time it was just a joke, the kind we all made at each other, except it never actually was it? Not really." "No," I said. "It wasn't." "I'm sorry," she said, and for the first time in the entire relationship I'd had with her, across 8 years and one very public rupture, it didn't sound rehearsed. Didn't sound like something crafted for an audience of 30 people at a dinner table. It sounded like something said quietly, to one other person, because it needed saying, and not because it needed witnessing. "I don't expect that to fix anything," she added. "I know it doesn't erase 8 years." "It doesn't," I agreed, "but I appreciate you saying it." She nodded, and for a moment we just stood there, two women who used to sit at the same table without ever really sitting together. And then she said, quieter still, "For what it's worth, this was the best night of my life. And I know that's because of you, all of it. I just wanted you to hear me say that part too." Then she walked off toward the fire pits, shoes still dangling from her fingers. And I stood there for a long moment before I let myself smile. Not out of triumph exactly, but out of something calmer and more durable than triumph, something closer to closure. I drove home a little after midnight, exhausted in the specific, satisfied way you're exhausted after a job done exactly right. And Owen was awake on the couch when I walked in, waiting up the way he always did on my longest event days. "How was it?" he asked. And I told him everything, start to finish. Adam's face by the carriage house, Gordon's toast that never quite named me, Patricia's stiff little concession by the dessert table, Brooke's unrehearsed apology by the fire pits. Owen listened the whole way through without interrupting, the way he always did. And when I finished, he just said, "That sounds like a full circle you didn't even have to force." "I didn't force any of it," I said. "That's the strange part. I just showed up and did my job, and the whole thing closed itself." "Maybe that's what actually winning looks like," he said. "Not a speech. Just competence, on your own terms, in a room they don't get to run anymore." I thought about that for a long time after he'd fallen asleep, lying awake in the dark the way I had that last night in the Belmead Colonial. Except this time, the wakefulness felt nothing like planning an escape. It felt like simply enjoying being exactly where I was. Monday morning, I was back at my desk by 8, the way I always was, answering emails, approving vendor invoices, confirming a site visit scheduled for Wednesday. The completely ordinary machinery of a business that ran on ordinary mornings. My phone rang around 9:15. Unknown Nashville number. Blue Ridge Table, this is Sophie. Hi, a woman's voice said. My name's Regina Ash. I was a guest at the wedding Saturday, and I have to say, that was the most beautifully run event I've ever attended. I'm getting married next spring, and after seeing your work, I have to ask, do you have anything available in the region, or do you only book at Falconhurst? I pulled up our calendar. We have a few dates open at 2 other venues we partner with. When were you thinking? May, ideally. I clicked through the system. The second Saturday's open. I'll take it, she said, laughing a little at her own speed. Can we schedule a proper consultation this week? We booked her for Thursday afternoon. After I hung up, I sat back in my chair for a moment. This was the 4th direct inquiry from Saturday's wedding alone. Word of mouth doing exactly what word of mouth does when the work underneath it is genuinely good. Not because of any Whitmore name attached to it, not even in spite of that name, simply independent of it entirely, the way I'd always wanted my career to run, back when I was 23 and pouring bourbon behind a hotel bar, with a 5-year plan and no idea yet how far off course that plan was about to get pulled. That same afternoon, Renata stopped by my office and settled into the chair across from my desk with the specific look she got when she'd already made a decision and was simply informing me of it rather than asking. I've been thinking, she said, about the partnership structure. What about it? I asked. You've proven yourself well past 30%, she said. I want to move you to 45. Full equal say in every major decision going forward. I blinked at her. Renata, that's an enormous jump. It's an accurate one, she said, in the same tone she'd used the day she first offered me equity at all. You built half of what this company has become in the last 18 months. I'm not gifting you anything. I'm correcting an undervaluation. I don't know what to say, I told her honestly. Say yes, she said. I laughed, for real. The kind of laugh that comes easily when nothing underneath it is performing for anyone. Yes. Good, she said, standing to leave. She paused at the door, the way she often did when she had one more thing to add. You know what I respect most about you? What? I asked. You've never once made yourself smaller to keep someone else comfortable. Not with me, not with a difficult client, not, from what you've told me, with anyone since the day you drove into this state. I used to, I said quietly. For 8 years, actually. But not anymore, she said. And that's the part that matters. I paid it forward in her exact careful shorthand later that week over dinner with my mother, who'd driven up again, this time just to celebrate the equity news rather than to check whether I was surviving. We went to a small restaurant near the river, ordered trout and cornbread and a slice of chess pie to split, and my mother studied me across the table the way she had that first visit. Except this time, there was nothing left to search for in my face. You used to call to check in when things were bad, she said. Now you call just to tell me good things. I don't think I realized how long it had been since you did that. I don't think I realized either, I admitted. For a long time, I think I was scared that if I told you how good things had gotten, it would jinx it somehow. Like admitting I was happy would make someone come take it away. Nobody's coming to take it away, baby girl, she said. You built a floor under yourself this time. Concrete, not carpet over a hole. I laughed at that because it was such a perfectly her way to put it, plain and true and completely unglamorous. Exactly the opposite of every Whitmore metaphor I'd spent 8 years absorbing. You taught me that, actually, I told her. You worked 2 jobs your whole life, so I'd have chances you didn't get. And you never once let anyone at that dental office or those houses you cleaned make you feel like less than you were. I stayed quiet too long about what that family was doing to you, she said, her voice catching slightly. I saw pieces of it every time you visited, the way you'd flinch before answering certain questions, the way you started talking about wine like you'd rehearsed it. I should have said something years earlier. I wouldn't have listened years earlier, I said honestly. I had to see it for myself in my own time, at my own table, on my own Thanksgiving. Well, she said, reaching across to squeeze my hand the way she had in the parking lot that first February. You saw it. And then you built an entire life proving you'd seen it correctly. We stayed at that table for almost 3 hours, talking about the business, about Owen, about Delwood and how the old bakery distribution route my father used to drive had finally shut down the year before, about everything ordinary and extraordinary that had happened in the 18 months since I'd driven a packed Honda CR-V across a state line with nothing but 4 boxes and a plan. Owen and I took a walk that same weekend along the greenway that follows the French Broad River, the kind of unhurried Sunday evening walk that had become our habit, past families out with dogs and kayakers pulling their boats up for the night. You've been quiet today, he observed, the way he always noticed things other people missed. Just thinking, I said, about how different everything is now compared to 2 years ago. 2 years ago, I was planning someone else's Thanksgiving centerpieces and getting corrected on which wine glass went where. Now I own almost half of a company I actually built. I have work I'm genuinely proud of, people around me who value what I bring instead of just what I do for them. I squeezed his hand. And a relationship where I don't feel like I have to shrink to fit inside it. You never had to shrink, he said. They just spent 8 years convincing you that you did. That's the strange thing about it, I said. You don't realize you're doing it until you're already small enough that nobody notices the difference. We walked for a while in comfortable silence, the river moving slow and gold in the last of the evening light, and then he asked, quietly, "Do you regret any of it? The 8 years, I mean. Not just the leaving." I thought about that seriously, the way I always tried to think seriously about anything he asked me, because he was one of the only people who'd ever asked me a real question and then actually waited for a real answer. I regret the time, I said finally. I don't regret the lesson, though, because the lesson turned out to be the most useful thing I've ever learned, which is that the opposite of disappearing isn't being noticed by other people. It's becoming so genuinely present in your own life that you stop needing anyone else's permission to take up space in it. He smiled at that, the small, unhurried smile he gave when something I said actually landed the way I'd meant it. That's very wise, he said. I had a very good therapist for a while, I told him, and we both laughed. Easy and unforced, the specific kind of laugh that only exists between 2 people who trust each other completely. I did have a very good therapist, actually. Someone I'd started seeing that first winter in Asheville, initially just to work through the divorce, and then, over time, to work through the much longer story underneath it. Her name was Dr. Priya Bansal, and one of the earliest things she said to me, in our second or third session, stuck with me more than almost anything else I learned in that small office over the following 2 years. You keep describing 8 years of your life as though you were simply too weak to leave sooner, she said. I'd like to offer a different framing. You weren't weak. You were systematically taught in 100 small ways that your own judgment couldn't be trusted. And it takes a genuinely strong person to eventually override years of that specific kind of conditioning and trust their own read on a situation again. I sat with that for a long time after our session ended, turning it over in the car, because it reframed something I'd been quietly ashamed of, the 8 years I'd stayed, into something closer to a story about eventual clarity rather than prolonged weakness. We spent a lot of our sessions that first year simply rebuilding my ability to trust my own instincts again. Whether a comment was actually a joke or actually a wound dressed up as one. Whether a compromise was mutual or one-directional. Whether my own reaction to something was proportionate or, as I'd been told so many times at Whitmore family dinners, overblown. By the time I stopped seeing her regularly, close to 2 years after that first appointment, I no longer needed anyone else to help me sort those distinctions out. I could simply feel them again, clearly, the way I had at 23, pouring bourbon behind a hotel bar with a 5-year plan and complete confidence in my own read of any room I walked into. 3 months after Brooke's wedding, on a quiet Thursday afternoon, a handwritten letter arrived at the Blue Ridge Table office, forwarded through our general business address because that was the only address the sender had access to. The return label said Chicago. It was from Adam. Sophie, it began. I drove past a bakery yesterday that reminded me of the blueberry buckle you used to bring to every family dinner, the one my mother always pushed to the back table. I never told you at the time that it was my favorite thing on that table every single year. I think about that a lot now, the ways I let small unkindnesses happen in front of me because objecting felt harder than staying comfortable. I took the Chicago transfer at the firm this spring, the same city you turned down 8 years ago because I asked you to stay. I understand the irony there better than I'd like to. My therapist says it's a healthy step, starting somewhere no one already has an opinion about who I'm supposed to be. I think it's a necessary one. I finally understand what you were trying to tell me for years, in 100 quiet ways I never once fully heard. You were the most real person I ever met, and I let an entire family convince both of us that real wasn't the same thing as valuable. I hope Asheville is treating you the way you deserve to be treated. I hear about the business sometimes, through Brooke mostly. It sounds like exactly the kind of thing you should have been building the whole time if I'd had the sense to get out of your way. Thank you for having the courage to leave when I clearly never would have found it myself. Adam. I read it twice, sitting alone at my desk after everyone else had gone home, and then I folded it carefully and set it in the bottom drawer where I kept my grandmother's original recipe card, not as a trophy, not as proof of anything, just as a marker of the distance between who I'd been at that table and who I'd become since walking away from it. I didn't write back. There was nothing left unsaid between us that a letter could fix. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like a complete thought rather than an unresolved one. The following spring, almost exactly 2 years to the week since I'd driven out of Belle Meade with everything I owned packed into a single trunk, a features editor from a regional lifestyle magazine called Southern Table and Terrace reached out to Blue Ridge Table about profiling our rapid growth for their annual Rising Voices in Hospitality issue. The interview took place on a Tuesday afternoon in Renata's office, the two of us sitting across from a young writer named Diane Okafor, who asked, near the end of our conversation, what I considered the single biggest turning point in the company's growth over the past 2 years. I thought about it for a moment before answering honestly. I think it was realizing that the thing holding my career back for most of my life wasn't a lack of skill, I told her. It was the fact that I'd spent almost a decade in an environment that only valued my labor when it was invisible, and the moment I found an environment that valued it out loud, everything else followed naturally. Diane wrote that down carefully, and when the piece ran 2 months later, that exact line appeared as the pull quote at the top of the article, printed in bold letters above a photograph of me standing in the Falconhurst Gardens, clipboard in hand, sun behind me. My mother framed a copy of that page and hung it in her kitchen in Delwood, right next to a photo of my Belmont graduation, as though the two milestones belonged in the same conversation, which, I'd come to realize, they finally did. The magazine feature brought a fresh wave of inquiries that summer, enough that Renata and I made the decision to open a second location, a satellite office in Greenville, South Carolina, to handle the growing demand from couples planning destination weddings across the wider Blue Ridge corridor. I flew down for the ribbon cutting on a bright June morning, cut a ceremonial length of blue ribbon with a pair of oversized scissors that felt slightly absurd in my hands, and thought, standing there in front of a small crowd of local vendors and press, about how far away that moment felt from a kitchen table in Belle Meade, where I'd once been told my little event job wasn't worth planning our own wedding around. I hadn't just built a business. I'd built proof, tangible and expanding, that the version of me the Whitmores had spent 8 years quietly diminishing had never actually been the accurate one. The Greenville office came with its own growing pains that first year. The ordinary friction of scaling a business faster than either Renata or I had originally planned for. We hired a site manager, a warm, meticulous man named Julian Foss, who'd run operations at a large downtown hotel for a decade before deciding he wanted to build something smaller and more personal. And the first few months of handing off real authority to someone new, trusting him to make the exact kind of judgment calls I'd once made entirely on my own, tested a muscle I hadn't fully developed yet, the muscle of stepping back instead of stepping in. I caught myself, more than once that spring, hovering over decisions that were no longer mine to make alone, calling Julian to double-check seating logistics he'd already handled perfectly well. And Renata eventually pulled me aside about it, gently but directly, the way she pulled me aside about most things. "You're doing the thing," she said. "What thing?" I asked, though I already suspected I knew. "Making yourself responsible for everything because some old part of you still doesn't trust that things will hold together if you're not personally managing every detail." She wasn't wrong. It took me the better part of that year to actually believe, in my body and not just my head, that building a company meant eventually trusting other capable people to run pieces of it without my constant oversight. The same way it had taken me years longer than it should have to believe that a marriage could hold together without my constant, exhausting vigilance either. Julian, as it turned out, ran that Greenville office beautifully, and by autumn it had its own thriving client base entirely independent of anything I personally touched, proof, in its own quiet way, that the thing I'd built could stand on its own, even when I finally, deliberately, stepped back from it. It was around that same time that word reached me, again through Maya, that Whitmore Capital Group had come under scrutiny from state regulators over a series of undisclosed fee arrangements in several client portfolios. The kind of quiet financial trouble that doesn't make front-page news, but moves fast through the specific social circles that once made up my entire world. Gordon, apparently, had stepped back from day-to-day operations while an internal review played out, and Adam, already settled into his new life in Chicago, reportedly had no interest in stepping back into the family firm to help manage the fallout. I felt, when I heard the news, something far more muted than I expected. No flare of satisfaction, no old wound reopening either. Mostly what I felt was distance, clean and complete. the specific kind of distance that comes from having built an entirely separate life with its own weather system, unaffected by storms happening in a state I no longer called home. I mentioned it to Owen once, briefly, over dinner, and he asked whether any part of me wanted to reach out, to check on anyone, to see how they were handling it. No, I said, and meant it fully. That family taught me, very thoroughly, that my concern for their comfort was never going to be returned in kind. I don't owe them my worry any more than they ever offered me theirs. Before all that, though, I should say something about how Owen and I actually became a couple in the first place, because it wasn't the immediate, cinematic click you sometimes hear about in stories like this one. For the first several months after that farm-to-table dinner where we met, we were simply friends, meeting occasionally for coffee, trading recommendations for hiking trails and paperback novels. And I remember, distinctly, the exact evening that shifted. It was a rainy Tuesday, maybe 8 months into knowing him, and I'd had a difficult call with Priya's office about a piece of the divorce paperwork that had gotten held up in processing. And I texted Owen, almost on impulse, something I'd never done before. I'm having a hard night. No need to respond. Just wanted to say it somewhere. He called me within 2 minutes, didn't ask a single probing question, just talked to me about nothing in particular. A documentary he'd watched, a bridge his firm was restoring downtown, until my hands stopped shaking and I could laugh again. When we finally hung up, 40 minutes later, he said, quietly, "I'm really glad you texted me instead of sitting with that alone." That was the moment, more than any grand gesture that came later, when I understood the specific shape of what I actually wanted in a partner. Someone who showed up fully for the small, unglamorous, difficult nights, not just the polished, photographable ones. Owen proposed to me that October, on the same greenway path along the French Broad where we'd had so many of our real conversations. No elaborate production, no hidden photographer, just the two of us and a small velvet box he'd apparently been carrying in his jacket pocket for 3 separate walks before he finally worked up the nerve. "I want to be very clear about something," he said, kneeling on the gravel path while a golden retriever wandered curiously toward us from somewhere nearby. "This isn't me asking you to become anything other than exactly who you already are. I've watched you build an entire life on your own terms, and I'm not interested in a version of this where you shrink even 1% to make room for me. I just want to be standing next to you while you keep building it." I said yes before he even finished lifting the ring from the box, laughing through it, the golden retriever now sitting patiently a few feet away, as if waiting politely for its turn to offer congratulations. Meeting Owen's mother, Diane Hale, for the first time that same winter, taught me more about what I'd been missing for 8 years than almost anything else in my new life. She was a retired school teacher who lived in a modest ranch house 20 minutes outside Asheville, and the first thing she did when Owen brought me over for dinner was ask me, seriously, sitting across a kitchen table covered in mismatched placemats, what I actually thought about the direction Blue Ridge table was heading. And then she listened to my entire answer without once interrupting to correct my grammar or steer the conversation towards something more comfortable for her. When I mentioned, later that evening, that I'd grown up watching my own mother clean other people's houses for a living, Diane didn't flinch, didn't perform sympathy, didn't subtly reposition the conversation the way Patricia always had whenever my background came up at a Whitmore dinner. She just said, "That's honest work. And it sounds like she raised you to understand the value of it, which is more than plenty of wealthy families manage to teach their own children." I remember driving home that night, quiet in the passenger seat, and Owen asking what I was thinking about. "Your mother asked me a real question, and then actually waited for my answer," I said. I don't think that's ever happened to me at a family dinner before, not once, in my entire adult life. He reached over and took my hand at the stoplight. "Get used to it," he said. "That's just how we do things around here." It took me longer than it should have to believe him, but eventually, dinner after ordinary dinner, I did. We were married the following June in a small backyard ceremony at Owen's mother's house outside Asheville. 40 guests total, no calligraphy place cards commissioned from a mother-in-law's preferred vendor, no seating chart engineered around business connections. My own mother walked me down a short grass aisle between 2 rows of mismatched folding chairs, and I remember thinking, standing there in a dress I'd chosen entirely by myself, that this was what a wedding was actually supposed to feel like. Not a performance staged for an audience's approval, but a genuine, unpolished celebration of 2 people who already knew exactly who they were to each other. That winter, a young woman named Tasha Reyes joined Blue Ridge Table as a junior coordinator, fresh out of a hospitality program in Charlotte, sharp and hungry the way I remembered being at 23. A few months into her training, she mentioned, almost in passing, over a late night of centerpiece assembly before a Saturday wedding, that her fiancé's family had strong opinions about her career, thought event planning was cute rather than serious, kept suggesting she consider something with better hours once they got married, something that would let her be more available for his family's frequent gatherings. I recognize the shape of that sentence the way you recognize a scar on someone else that matches one of your own. "Can I tell you something?" I said, setting down the ribbon spool in my hands. "That I don't usually bring up at work?" She nodded, curious. I told her in broad strokes about the Whitmores, about 8 years of quietly disappearing into someone else's expectations, about the exact specific gravity of a family deciding your ambitions are decorative rather than real. "The people who actually value you," I told her, "will never ask you to become smaller to make yourself easier to love. If you ever find yourself negotiating down your own future to fit someone else's comfort, that's not compromise. That's erosion, and it doesn't stop on its own." Tasha was quiet for a long moment, turning a piece of ribbon over in her fingers. "How did you know it was time to leave?" she asked finally. "When I stopped being able to tell the difference between compromise and disappearing," I said. "The day I couldn't tell them apart anymore was the day I finally left." She didn't say much else that night, but 6 weeks later, she told me, quietly, over coffee before a shift, that she'd ended the engagement, that it hadn't been an easy conversation, that she was scared, but certain. I didn't take any credit for that decision, because it was entirely hers to make and hers to carry. But I did feel, watching her walk into the venue that morning with her shoulders a little straighter than they'd been in months, a very specific kind of gratitude that the worst chapter of my own life had turned into something that could actually help someone else recognize the shape of theirs before it cost them 8 years instead of one conversation. Tasha is a full coordinator now, running her own events independently, and last spring she got engaged again, this time to a man who apparently spent his own savings helping her put a down payment on a small house near downtown Asheville, without once suggesting she'd need to scale back her career to make room for the relationship. She brought him by the office to introduce him, and I remember watching the two of them together, easy and unguarded in a way that made something in my chest loosen with relief. The specific relief of watching someone avoid a version of the mistake you spent almost a decade making yourself. "He asked me what my 5-year plan was on our 3rd date," she told me later, laughing. "Nobody's ever asked me that before, like they actually wanted to help build it instead of quietly steer me away from it." I told her that was, in my experience, one of the clearest signs worth paying attention to, long before any ring or wedding date ever entered the picture. Whether the person across the table treats your ambitions as something to be protected or something to be politely managed down to a more convenient size. I think about all the small signs looking back that I either missed entirely or noticed and talked myself out of taking seriously for years before that final Thanksgiving finally forced my hand. The way Adam changed the subject whenever I mentioned wanting to apply somewhere outside Nashville. The way Patricia's compliments always arrived with a quiet asterisk attached, a but or a for someone like you, that reframed the praise into something smaller by the time the sentence finished. The way I'd started rehearsing my own opinions in the car before family dinners, editing them down to versions I predicted would draw the least resistance, without ever once asking myself why an honest opinion needed editing in the first place. None of those signs, on their own, would have been enough to convince anyone to leave a marriage. Together, accumulated patiently over 8 years, they were the entire story. And I've come to believe that's exactly how it works for most people in situations like the one I was in. Not one dramatic betrayal you can point to and explain in a single sentence, but a long, quiet accumulation of moments that only become visible, in full, once you're finally standing far enough away to see the whole shape of them at once. By the 3rd anniversary of the night I drove out of Belmead, Blue Ridge Table had grown into a 3-location company spanning western North Carolina and upstate South Carolina, with a booking calendar that stretched nearly 2 years out and a staff of 19 full-time coordinators, florists, and event managers. Renata and I had restructured the partnership again that spring, this time to a full 50-50 ownership split, a decision she'd insisted on over my own objections that it was too generous. "It's not generous," she told me, echoing the exact phrase she'd used the very first time she'd offered me equity, years earlier, in that same small office. It's accurate. I flew back to Nashville only twice that entire year, both times for short visits to see my mother, who'd since sold the old Delwood house and moved into a comfortable condo closer to Asheville, close enough that our visits no longer required an entire day's drive. On the second of those trips, purely by coincidence, I ran into Patricia Whitmore in the parking lot of a garden center outside Belmead, both of us reaching for spring annuals at the same display table. She looked smaller than I remembered, or perhaps I had simply grown large enough in the intervening years that the scale between us had permanently shifted. "Sophie," she said, visibly startled, "I heard about your business. The Falconhurst wedding was extraordinary." "Thank you," I said, and left it there, because there was nothing else I needed to add. No old wound left open enough to require tending in a garden center parking lot on an ordinary Tuesday. "I should have," she started, then stopped herself, glancing down at the flat of petunias in her hands, as though the sentence had gotten lost somewhere between her chest and her mouth. "It's all right, Patricia," I said, and meant it in the specific, complete way you can only mean forgiveness once it no longer costs you anything to offer it. "I hope you're well." I paid for my plants and drove back to my mother's condo, and I remember feeling the whole way there an almost weightless kind of peace, the particular peace that comes from realizing a person who once had the power to make you feel invisible now simply couldn't reach you at all. Maya, through everything, remained exactly the friend she'd been the morning she showed up with 3 coffees and a stack of flattened boxes. She got married herself that same year to a quiet, steady structural engineer named Ben she'd met at a mutual friend's cookout, and asked me to be her maid of honor, an easy yes that felt like a small, satisfying bookend to the story of the two of us. I gave a toast at her wedding that ran longer than I'd planned, telling the room about the 6 a.m. phone call, about the boxes, about the specific, immediate way she'd said, "What do you need?" instead of, "Are you sure?" And I watched her cry, completely unbothered by her own mascara, in a way that felt like the exact opposite of every performed, camera-ready emotion I'd spent 8 years watching at Whitmore family events. Afterward, near the bar, she pulled me aside and said, "You know, I think about that morning all the time. Not because it was dramatic, because it was the first time in years I'd watched you make a decision entirely for yourself. And I remember thinking, packing those boxes, that I was finally getting my actual friend back. You never lost me," I told her. "You just had to watch me lose myself for a while first," she said, which is a harder thing to sit through than people realize. Watching someone slowly disappear from the sidelines, wanting to say something, and knowing it wouldn't land yet. I've thought about that phrase more than once since, watching someone disappear from the sidelines, because I think it captures something true about how these situations actually look to the people who love you, long before you're ready to name what's happening to yourself. I've since made a quiet habit, whenever I notice that particular look on a friend's face, the one Maya must have worn across 100 coffee dates I barely remember, of saying something instead of waiting politely for the right moment. Sometimes it lands. Sometimes it doesn't. Not yet. But I'd rather be the friend who said something a little too early than the one who, like everyone at that Thanksgiving table, stayed comfortably, conveniently silent until laughing along was easier than speaking up. I think about that Thanksgiving table more than I expected I would, even now, years past it. Not because it still hurts, but because it's become the clearest marker I have of the exact moment my life split into a before and an after. Before, I was a woman who color-coordinated centerpieces for people who moved them 2 inches to the left without a word of thanks. After, I was a woman who built a company good enough that the same family eventually paid full retail price for the privilege of hiring me. I don't say that to sound bitter, because I genuinely am not anymore, not after everything that's happened since. I say it because it took me a long time to understand something that seems obvious now. The version of me who sat quietly at that table, absorbing insult after insult, wasn't a weaker version of who I actually was. She was simply a version of me who hadn't yet been given permission, by anyone, including herself, to take up the space she'd always been capable of taking up. Nobody gave me that permission at the barbecue, at the Thanksgiving table, on any of the 8 years' worth of holidays I spent making other people's lives run smoothly while my own quietly stalled out. I had to give it to myself, alone, at 3 a.m, in a small home office that used to be meant for a nursery, with nothing but a laptop and a decision I'd been circling for years without ever quite landing on it. Owen and I welcomed our daughter Iris the following spring. 4 years almost exactly after that last Whitmore Thanksgiving. And I remember holding her in the hospital room, exhausted and overwhelmed in the specific way new parents are, thinking about the family I'd walked away from, and the family I was, in that moment, actively building instead. My mother arrived within hours, driving up from her condo with a bag of clothes she'd apparently kept packed and ready for weeks in anticipation. And she held Iris for the better part of an hour, humming something low and familiar, the same tune she used to hum over my crib according to family stories I'd heard my whole life. "You're going to raise her to know her own worth from the very beginning," my mother said, looking up at me. "Not have to spend 8 years learning it the hard way, like her mama did." "That's the plan," I said, and meant it as completely as I'd ever meant anything. Iris's middle name, we decided before she was even born, would be Ruth, after my grandmother, the same grandmother whose blueberry buckle recipe had been shoved to the back of a dessert table by a woman who'd never once bothered to actually taste it before dismissing it. That recipe, incidentally, had become something of a signature dessert across all 3 Blue Ridge Table locations by then, requested by name on nearly a third of our wedding menus. A small, private, delicious irony I never got tired of. Iris is 2.5 now as I'm telling you all of this. A stubborn, funny, fiercely opinionated little person who already at this age interrupts adults mid-sentence when she wants to say something, without a trace of the hesitation it took me 30 years and one entire marriage to unlearn. She calls Blue Ridge Table's Falconhurst location Mama's Garden, and knows most of the coordination staff by name, waving at them from her stroller like visiting royalty whenever I bring her along on a slow Tuesday walkthrough. My mother watches her most Thursdays, the two of them baking versions of the blueberry buckle together with a plastic mixing bowl and a recipe card that's now been photocopied so many times the original handwriting is starting to blur at the edges. And I've promised myself, quietly, on more nights than I can count, that Iris will never once have to earn her place at any table the way I spent 8 years earning mine. She'll simply have one, unconditionally, from the very beginning, the way every child deserves to. Blue Ridge Table, meanwhile, opened a 4th location that same year, this one back in the mountains just outside Nashville, close enough to my old life that the symmetry of it isn't lost on me even now. Renata and I debated the decision for months before committing to it, wary of how it might feel to build something thriving in the exact backyard of the family that once made me feel so thoroughly disposable. In the end, I decided the location made sense on its own merits. Strong regional demand, an underserved luxury wedding market, nothing to do with anyone named Whitmore at all. And that decision, choosing a business move purely because it was the right business move, rather than as any kind of statement, felt like its own quiet proof of how far I'd actually come. I don't drive past the Bellmead estate when I'm in town for work now, not out of any lingering pain, but simply because there's no longer any reason to. It isn't part of the route between anywhere I'm going and anywhere I actually need to be. There's a version of this story, the version I sometimes imagine Patricia or Brooke or even Adam might tell if you asked them, where I simply overreacted to one bad joke at one uncomfortable dinner, where the whole thing gets flattened down into a single moment of drama rather than the slow, patient accumulation of 8 years it actually was. I understand now why families like the Whitmores need that flattened version. It's much easier to believe a person snapped over a single comment than to sit with the much heavier truth that they spent nearly a decade watching a specific, cumulative erosion happen right in front of them, and never once, not a single time, thought it was worth interrupting on my behalf. Brooke's comment wasn't the wound. It was simply the moment the wound finally became visible enough that even I, after years of practiced denial, could no longer talk myself out of naming it. Looking back on all of it now, from the distance of a life I actually chose, I understand what Brooke's comment really was, even though I don't think she understood it herself in the moment she said it. It wasn't cruelty in the way I first experienced it, sharp and public and humiliating at a table full of witnesses who laughed instead of objecting. It was, in its own accidental way, a gift. The kind that only reveals itself as one long after the wrapping paper has been torn off and thrown away. She challenged me to disappear, meaning it as a dismissal, meaning to remind me exactly how replaceable she believed I was in a family I'd spent 8 years trying to earn a permanent seat in. I did disappear, just not in any of the ways she meant. I disappeared out of a life where my worth had always been conditional, where love came wrapped in expectations I never remembered agreeing to, where every contribution I made got filed quietly under things a good wife simply does, rather than things a whole, capable person accomplishes. And I reappeared, a year later, and then 2, and then 3, in a life where my name went on the partnership papers, where my work got credited out loud, where the people around me actually noticed when I walked into a room, instead of only noticing occasionally when I left one early. If there's a single lesson underneath everything that happened between that Thanksgiving table and the wedding at Falconhurst Manor, it's this. You cannot negotiate with people who have already, quietly, decided you're disposable. I spent years trying. I offered vendor expertise nobody wanted to hear from me. I offered honest feedback on a business plan that got applauded when I gave it and then completely forgotten when the money actually needed to change hands. I offered $22,000 of my own hard-earned savings toward a family member's dream and got told, when it failed, that I hadn't really needed that money anyway. None of that negotiation ever worked, not once. Not because I was bad at negotiating, but because you cannot bargain your way into being valued by people who have already built an entire identity around the idea that your value is optional. The only thing that ever actually worked, the only strategy that produced a real, lasting result, was removing myself completely from a system that required my erasure in order to keep running smoothly. And once I did that, once I actually left instead of continuing to ask, politely, for a seat that was never going to be offered in good faith, I discovered something that nobody in that family ever once told me. Probably because none of them had ever needed to learn it themselves. You don't actually need the people who dismissed you to eventually acknowledge what you've built. You only need to keep building it, patiently, on your own terms, until the scale of what you've made speaks for itself, loud enough that even the people who once laughed at your expense have no choice but to hear it. I think, too, about how much of my own disappearing I mistook, for years, for love. I told myself that turning down Chicago was compromise, the healthy give and take every marriage requires. I told myself that investing my entire savings into Brooke's startup was generosity, the kind family owes each other unconditionally. I told myself that quietly absorbing years of small corrections about my clothes, my vocabulary, my seating placement at family dinners was simply the reasonable price of belonging somewhere I hadn't been born into. None of that was actually love, not the kind worth calling by that name. Real compromise moves in two directions. Real generosity gets remembered, not weaponized against you later as proof you never really needed the money in the first place. Real belonging doesn't require you to keep making yourself smaller in order to remain welcome. I couldn't see any of that clearly while I was still inside it, which is, I've come to believe, exactly how these situations are designed to work. The erosion happens too slowly to notice in any single moment. You only see the full shape of what's been worn away once you're standing far enough outside it to measure the distance. I want to say something directly to anyone listening to this who recognizes even a piece of themselves in what I've just described. If you've ever sat at a table, literal or otherwise, and felt yourself get smaller with every passing year in order to remain comfortable company for people who never once made the same effort in return, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not overreacting. You are not too sensitive. And you are not asking for too much simply because you'd like to be treated as though your presence actually matters. If the people around you have made you feel, even once, like your disappearance would be a minor inconvenience rather than a genuine loss, that feeling is information, not an overreaction to be talked yourself out of. Pay attention to it. The people who actually value you will never need you to disappear in order to stay comfortable in their own lives. They will make room. They will notice the effort. They will say thank you out loud in front of other people, not just when it's convenient. I also want to say something about the specific kind of courage it takes to leave quietly instead of loudly, because I think that part gets lost sometimes in stories like this one. I didn't scream at that Thanksgiving table. I didn't throw a plate or storm out or give anyone a moment they could later use as proof that I was unstable, dramatic, difficult to manage. I said 2 words, calm and clear. And then I spent the next 72 hours planning my exit with the same methodical patience I used to plan a wedding timeline. That quiet, deliberate kind of leaving doesn't make for the most explosive version of this story, but it made for the most complete one, because it left me with a clean paper trail, an intact reputation, and absolutely nothing anyone in that family could point to and call the real reason things fell apart. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do isn't the loudest thing. Sometimes it's simply refusing to give people who've already decided not to see you the satisfaction of watching you fall apart in front of them. The last thing I want to leave you with is this. The opposite of being invisible isn't demanding that everyone around you finally, belatedly, notice you exist. That's a strategy that keeps your entire sense of worth tethered to people who have already shown you, repeatedly, that they're not particularly interested in looking. The actual opposite of disappearing is becoming so genuinely present in a life you built for yourself, on your own terms, that whether or not the old table ever notices simply stops being the point. I didn't leave Belmead to prove anything to the Whitmores. I left because I finally understood that proving anything to them had never once been a productive use of my time. What I built afterward, the company, the marriage that actually reciprocates, the daughter who will never once have to earn a place at her own family's table, none of that was revenge. It was simply what happens when you stop spending your energy trying to be seen by people who've decided not to look, and start spending it building something so real, so entirely yours, that it doesn't require anyone's permission to exist. Some of the people who make you feel small aren't actually trying to hurt you on purpose. They're simply showing you, in the clearest way they know how, that you're sitting at the wrong table. The answer was never going to be fighting harder for a seat at that one. It was building a table of my own, one sturdy and beautiful enough that the people who once treated me as optional would eventually have no choice but to pay full price to sit at it. If any part of this story felt familiar to you, if you've ever quietly disappeared a little more of yourself with every year spent trying to earn a place that was never going to be freely given, I hope you'll take that recognition seriously, instead of talking yourself out of it the way I did for 8 long years. You are allowed to leave rooms that require your disappearance in order to feel comfortable. You are allowed to build somewhere else entirely, somewhere your presence gets celebrated instead of merely tolerated. Somewhere a joke about your absence would never land because everyone at the table already knows exactly what would be missing without you in it. Thank you for staying with me through this whole story. If it resonated with you at all, I'd love to hear which part hit closest to home. And if you take nothing else from it, take this. The life that actually fits you is waiting on the other side of the courage it takes to walk away from the one that's been quietly asking you to disappear. Go build your table. Make it beautiful. And never, ever apologize for finally taking up the exact amount of space you were always meant to.